So what we have is that there's this continuous tradition from the earliest of times, this messianic lineage, this serpent line that throughout the ages provide these different messianic Nephilim messiahs that's born from this lineage. And as I've said, I believe that this will happen again.
So, from a pre-flood Messiah to ancient God emperors and Roman Caesars, we trace a long tradition of Nephilim Messiahs and ask what a future Nephilim Messiah might look like. So, I'm looking forward to a very exciting episode. So, Willie, how does the August stripling born from the 8 fallen gods in the Edfu text represent the earliest Nephilim Messiah? And what does it show about pre-deluge shamanistic practices?
Yeah, so the Edfu texts are actually our oldest tradition about the Nephilim. And the August stripling that you refer to, it's an old terminology. It's just this glorious youngster, this child that was born. And he plays a very important role in the Edfu tradition. Now, he was born to 8 gods that was born from the seed of the earth god, the primitive earth god that fell on the ground. So the seed of this earth god fell, this primitive earth god fell on the ground. And this motive of seed that fell on the ground, divine seed, actually refers to the fallen gods. An alternative way of saying the same thing would be the sons of the gods, the seed of the gods that fell on the earth. That's the fallen sons of the gods. And in the biblical tradition, in Genesis 6, verse 4, we read about the sons of God who had these children with maidens, human maidens, and from whom were born the Nephilim. So this is exactly the same tradition, this fallen seed. Later on in biblical tradition, we find in the book of Revelation, in Revelation chapter 12, that this very same image of fallen seed are now presented as fallen stars that fell on the earth. But this is just a more refined way of saying the same thing that we find in this ancient, more crude traditions from the ancient world. So it refers to the fallen seed, the fallen gods, and from them were born this messianic child. Now, we find exactly the same tradition that we find in Egypt, where from the earth god were born 8 gods. These 8 gods include 4 pairs for female goddesses and 4 gods. We find exactly the same equivalent in Sumer, in ancient Sumer. That's why we believe that this tradition actually originated in Sumer, which, according to the Edfu texts, it's often referred to as the original homeland of the gods, from where they migrated to Egypt, where they built the first temples. Anyhow, so in Sumer, we have the god Enki, the god of the earth, and his seed fell on the ground. Yes. And again, 8 gods were born from the seed, 4 goddesses and 4 gods. So this is just the story of the fallen gods in both Egyptian, very early Egyptian and Sumerian tradition. Now, in Egyptian tradition, we have this extra bit of information about this messianic child that was born. And what is interesting about him, his name PN, it's like Ben that we have in Hebrew, which means son. So he was the seed, in a certain sense, the promised seed, but not from a biblical perspective. It's not the seed that we read about in Genesis, the seed of the woman that we're talking about. Because yes, the earth god in both Egyptian and Sumerian tradition were also often depicted and portrayed as a serpent. So this is actually the serpent seed, and his wife, Ningursag, Enki's wife, was also portrayed as a serpent woman. So this is why we believe that this...
So that refers to the section in the Bible where it's referred to that there will be conflict between her seed and your seed.
Yeah, so we'll come back when we discuss Enoch and those traditions, Etana and so forth, then we will come back to that and discuss that in detail. So what at this point,
Yes.
what is important is that this God, this messianic figure, was born in the time before the deluge. That's very important. It's quite clearly stressed within the framework of the Egyptian Edfu tradition. And this child had a
And why is that very important, Willie?
well, this child had a shining face, and he had the sun and the moon for eyes. And as we will see later in this episode, this is the typical archetype for the Nephilim Messiah. So he was born in that time. He's first a shining one, and the shining ones it's actually a topic that we've discussed in some detail previously. So these spirits or diamonds associated with the Nephilim, they were also called the shining ones. And in his person, in this Messiah's person, this shining one got a very clear and definite manifestation. And from him, then, we believe there was a lineage that came through the deluge to the time afterwards. And we'll return to that later on when we discuss the post-deluge period in more detail. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting topic. So I think the one thing that stands out in these various traditions, you have reference to, let's say, the August Stripling or this Nephilim messianic figure. It's in the time before the flood. And from there on, it stretches out through history. So that leads me to my second question. How did the Ningirsu warrior god Messiah figure shape the Sumerian messianic ideal? And what shamanistic root from the Zagros Mountains created the ideal?
Yeah, so this is very important. So what we find in Sumerian tradition is that the Enki, the god Enki, he is shown with the eagle, the Anzu eagle in his hand. And in this eagle, in this particular case, and in this tradition, refers to the shamanistic eagle. So it's the shaman's tree with the eagle in the top and the snake at the bottom. Now, this shamanistic eagle, or it's also later on called the Anzu, is very important because Ningirsu that you have referred to is the anthropomorphic figure of this Anzu. So the Anzu, this bird, this powerful storm bird representing the storm clouds, and in effect, this great spirit, he finds expression in an anthropomorphic form within the framework of the god Ningirsu. Ningirsu was the son of Enki. He had the sun and the moon for eyes. He is described
exactly the same as the Stripling.
Exactly. He is described with this shining, glorious appearance in the morning when the sun rises. This is quite interesting because he actually captures, he's the archetypal kind of image of the Nephilim Messiah. Now, what we find is there was a personal aspect to this. Let me first say this before I go to the personal aspect. So in Egypt, we have the equivalent figure to Ningirsu, which is not an eagle, but a falcon. And in that case, it's Horus. Horus is closely connected with the TN god in that tradition. And he also, Horus again, has the sun and moon for eyes. So it's the same kind of tradition that we have in both Egypt and in Sumer. Now, what we find...
It's just following the imagery.
Yeah, so what we find is this image, this messianic image of Ningirsu, actually goes back, this messianic ideal, to a personal dimension of the shaman being born within the tree. And the first person ever in history of which we have an account of him being reborn in the nest of the Anzu eagle is Lugalbanda. Lugalbanda is described as being reborn in the nest, awake. When he woke, he's in the bird's nest. He's a chick of the bird with the other chicks. He's been reborn as a shamanistic bird, as a new great spirit. Now, the equivalent of this spirit, the equivalent, is what we find in terms of the messianic figures. The messianic figure only applies to a larger extent, to the larger population, within that framework that the Messiah would be born. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and then with Lugalbanda, it's this image of a superhuman figure, and later he becomes the deified king of Uruk.
Yeah. So he's a legendary king of Uruk, and he lived. He is mentioned just after Enmerkar in the Sumerian king list. We actually identify Enmerkar with the biblical Nimrod. We'll come back to that and discuss it in great detail in a future episode. But at this point, it's quite interesting. So it relates to that period in history that we have the Tower of Babel events, in my opinion. Yes.
Sort of loops back. So a very interesting character is Gilgamesh or Gilgamesh. Now, Willie, how does Gilgamesh perfectly embody the post-deluge Nephilim Messiah?
Yeah, so what we find is, I've not just referred to the Tower of Babel events. So in this case, what we have is again, Lugalbanda representing this mighty bird. And with through the sacred marriage ritual, his partner was Ninsun. She was most likely the daughter of Enmerkar, because that's what we read in the find in the Babylonian tradition about these events.
Yeah.
And they had certain children, and their children was again described because she was identified with the earth, with Ki. So his seed falling on the ground then was born in the form of first 7 gods, the Sabitu gods, the young men that accompanied Lugalbanda to the land of Arata in the north. And then the 8th one that was born to them was Dumuzi. And then the 9th one born to them, according to tradition, was Gilgamesh. So he was the 9th one, in the same way that in the time before the Great Flood, we had the 8 gods, and the 9th one being the messianic figure. We again have the 8 gods being born from the sacred marriage, and then the 9th one being Gilgamesh. And he was regarded as 2/3 a god. He was divine to some extent. Yes. In one of his great epic tales, he's described as having the shining face and the name Gibil. That's the shining god of ancient Sumerian tradition, actually appears in the cuneiform form of his name. So he's the shining one that was born, and he became the greatest of all Sumerian heroes. So if we read in Genesis chapter 6 that the Nephilim are men of renown, it's difficult to see that to believe that the biblical author didn't also have Gilgamesh in mind. Because in the case of Gilgamesh, we do read that in another tradition, but closely related to the Lugalbanda and Ninsun tradition, that his father, which is actually called the high priest, which was in this case Lugalbanda, was also a high spirit, a great spirit, a Lilu spirit. And he was born from this spirit. Later on in the Babylonian tradition, it became an invisible man, was his dad, his father. And he's the archetype of the Nephilim. He was also described as a giant. So he was a great messianic figure, but he was, in a certain sense, the great Sumerian Nephilim Messiah. And he was the greatest of them all in ancient Sumerian history, and there can be no doubt about it.
That is very, very interesting. So Willie, just a little caveat. If we talk about the sacred marriage or the Hieros Gamos, can you just, for people that don't know what that is, just in one line, explain what you refer to when you say that?
Yeah, so we had a very old tradition in ancient Sumer, going back to the time before the deluge, definitely, where to secure the fertility of the land, the high priest and the high priestess would sleep together on a particular day, the first day of the year. That was when the Pleiades rose in the east, early in the morning, the Pleiades, which I've just referred to, the 7 gods. And this is also interesting because the way that the position of the Pleiades shifted through time because of the precession of the equinoxes, we find that there's a particular period, according to what we read in the celestial skies, when these gods were to be born on earth. And it's exactly how we understand history and when the 7 gods were born on earth. So what we have is this was the sacred marriage ritual once a year, and it was actually believed that this great spirit or this God possessed seemingly the high priest, and then through the high priest, he fathered these children with Ninsun. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks for that. That clears up a few things. So how does the great Akkadian emperors embody the Nephilim Messiah?
Yeah, so after Gilgamesh, the great king of Uruk, and the greatest of all Sumerian heroes, after the Uruk period, after some time towards the end of the age of Taurus, the Akkadians became the lords of the land of Mesopotamia, and Sargon, the great founder of the Akkadian Empire, conquered the entire known world. He was one of the greatest of ancient kings, and he was definitely the first emperor, because the Akkadian emperor was the very first emperor in world history. It was believed, according to his birth legend, and the way that I interpret it, that he was born from the sacred marriage. Again, his mother bore him in secret. She put him into a small enclosure on the river, and then later on the gardener, which was just another term for the high priest, actually found him in the river, took him from the river, and brought him up as a gardener, gardening the dates, which played an extremely important role within this particular cult. So he was born from the gods, and in some of his epic tradition, we find some of the variations of the story, we find that he's actually described as not having had a father, because obviously, according to their way of understanding it, his father was a god. And he himself, he was this great conqueror. And then on his victory stele, we find that he is portrayed in the form of Ningirsu. He's portrayed exactly as Ningirsu, as if he is the god Ningirsu. So Ningirsu find expression within
the reincarnated
in the
god,
form of Sargon. And what we find later on with his grandson, and this is quite amazing, because his grandson was Naram-Sin. Naram-Sin, Sargon was in later Mesopotamian tradition regarded as the great ideal for all kings. But Naram-Sin was the greatest of all kings in Mesopotamian history. He was the greatest. He was regarded as a god. After a great rebellion against his rule, he was still a young man. After he succeeded and he won, he was recognized by all the other gods of Mesopotamia, that's their priests and the priestly orders, that he was indeed a god. So Naram-Sin was regarded as a god. He actually had a temple built for him. He was the god of Akkad. So in the same way that other gods were related to certain cities in ancient Sumer and Mesopotamia, for example, Enki was associated with Eridu, or Enlil was associated with Nippur. So he was the god of Akkad. This is where he was venerated and worshipped. And then we read that in his epic tales, how he even described it in his own inscriptions. He described himself as the god Naram-Sin. And in his epic tradition, we read how he goes about as the god of the land, and how 4 gods accompany him, both on each side a god, in front and behind him also 2 gods or goddesses. So where humans had 2 geniuses, they believed that 2 geniuses, one on the right and one on the left-hand side. He was a god, so he had 4 geniuses represented by these 4 gods and goddesses. And then we read, for example, in this one epic tale, Naram-Sin and the Lord of Apisal, we read, your radiance is fire. So he had this massive radiance. Sargon also in his epic tales described to some extent with this radiance, but with Naram-Sin it's in a new level. He has this radiance. Your radiance is fire. Your voice is the thunderstorm. Now remember, the Anzu bird represented the thunderstorm. We read,
that's the thunderbird.
Yeah, you are a raging lion. Your mouth is a venomous viper. Your nails are those of the Anzu. So he is partly Anzu, but now we find the combination of the Anzu with the serpent. These 2 are brought together. So where we find that Gilgamesh was regarded as 2/3 a god. Now for the first time in history, we find that one from this lineage was regarded as a god, as one of the great gods of Sumer, was worshipped in this way, had his own temple and priestly order set aside for his worship while he was still alive. So he was the great exemplar in the ancient world of a Nephilim Messiah, definitely without any doubt. And the church that started, I call it a church because it was not only a cult, it was similar to the Christian church much later on that came after Jesus Christ, but it had very similar features. And he was the god that was worshipped within this imperial cult of the Akkadians. And the whole cultic expression and how they worship this god, this messianic figure within this setting. It's just fascinating. I write about it in the first volume of, quite extensively, the first volume of the Nephilim. Yeah, so in that sense, he actually left a legacy, not only in the great epic tradition about this god emperor, but also in terms of his cult that survived the centuries and later on spread to the Mediterranean region and survived into the Christian epoch.
Yeah. What I find fascinating is it's this tradition, but it's a linear tradition that runs right through history, and it sort of appears in different individuals.
Yes, absolutely.
And that brings me to my next question. How did this Nephilim Messianic tradition appear in Rome through Julius Caesar and Augustus? And how does this stand in opposition to the biblical Messiah?
Okay, so what we find in this case with regard to the Roman emperors is that Julius, or the Eloi, that's the family, the gens from which they were born, were regarded as sons of both Jupiter, that's the equivalent, the Roman equivalent of the Greek Zeus, and Venus. So they were descendants of the gods, scions of the gods. And they were also regarded, both Julius Caesar and his grandnephew Augustus, as sons or scions of Mars. So they were descendants of the gods. That's how they believed themselves to have been descendants of the gods. Julius Caesar was definitely the greatest Roman that ever lived. And through his actions, he changed the entire setting and brought about the end of the Roman Republic. And his grandnephew then afterwards established the great Roman Empire. It was like
and it's interesting if you Yeah, if you look at Julius Caesar, the Roman Senate declared him divine. They called him Divus Julius.
Absolutely, but that was after
When
his death.
yeah,
So he was worshipped as a
yes,
god after his death, and then Augustus called himself the Son of God. Because he
yes,
was
yes.
then the
So
son, saw himself as he was the adopted son of Julius Caesar in his will.
yeah, the son of the divine Divi Filius. Fascinating.
Yeah. So in the case of Augustus, what we find is that his genius was also worshipped as divine. So that's not far removed from his own person. So he was called Divus Filius Augustus. His whole name, his
Yeah,
official title was Imperator Caesar Divi Filius Augustus. And he was later on the
yeah.
divine Augustus. That's what he called himself in his great deeds. And that was how he was officially accepted his title by the Roman Senate. So he
Yeah,
was.
and it's interesting because they said he's bringing peace, order, and a new age.
Absolutely.
Um,
Let me first say this. So his genius was worshipped also in temples, and a priestly order was set aside for the worship of Augustus while he was still alive. Exactly what we find with regard to Naram-Sin. Now, for Virgil, in his fourth eclogue, he wrote it in the form of a Sibylline prophecy. And in this, he proclaimed that the last and final age announced by previous Sibyls had arrived. So the Sibyls arrived certain ages before a certain messianic figure would appear on the world scene. And in this eclogue, Virgil, he clearly presents Augustus as this messianic figure, the one that will bring peace to the world, the one from the seat of Jupiter who would become the ruler of the world. That's what he says. And then he says that this glorious new age will be comparable to the golden age associated with Kronos long before. So Augustus was this typical messianic figure. He was a great messianic figure, and the first one of the Romans, and some of the later Caesars also required this kind of worship. For example, Nero, which was also from his lineage.
yes.
But he was the first one. He established this way of thinking, which was in the Roman Republic. It was totally beyond their way of. They just couldn't assume that something like that could happen. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting because Rome says salvation comes through power, order, and a divine ruler over you, whereas the biblical message is different.
Yeah. So in a certain
yeah.
sense, Augustus is the opposite of Jesus Christ. He's the exact opposite. Jesus was actually born in about 6 BC, and that was while Augustus was emperor. So in 14 AD, when Augustus died, Jesus was about 20 years of age. And Jesus also called himself the Son of God, but in a different sense, the Son of the Supreme God. So we had the same titles. And then when Jesus took his disciples to Caesarea Philippi, there was a temple for the worship of Augustus stood at that sanctuary. He was worshipped together with Rome, impersonated as a woman. And it was exactly at that spot where Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do the people say I am?" So he opposed himself to Augustus, who said he was the Son of God. And he said, "I am the true Son of God. I'm the true Messiah." So we find this opposition very clearly expressed in this passage. And later on, Nero, for example, who was born from his lineage, was also regarded by early church fathers and many others as a definite type of the Antichrist. Yes.
Yeah. So it's The reason why Christians got into trouble is because they say Jesus is Lord. And it wasn't just spiritual, it was a direct contradiction of the Nephilim Messiah's claim.
Yes, is right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So Willie, across the 9 ages in your trilogy, do you see this evil messianic seed or Nephilim Messiah archetype still active today? And I'm sort of referring to bloodlines and secret doctrines.
So what I show in the 9 ages and also in the trilogy, the Nephilim trilogy, is that we have a continuous tradition. From the earliest of times, we have a continuous Nephilim tradition. There's no doubt about it. It's a continuous Nephilim tradition. So what we find is that this continuous tradition clearly includes within these circles and this group of families certain lineages that was through the ages regarded as the messianic line, the red line. Usually, we'll come back to that.
Yes.
So they definitely believe that again, at some point in time, another messianic figure will be born from this lineage. The other great figures that we've discussed were clearly from the same lineage. I discussed that in some detail in the trilogy, and they believe that another one will arise in future. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting with the last episode, and if people haven't listened to that, I think they need to do that. We refer to the 2 pillars, and the one, according to tradition, is black, and the other one is red. The one represents knowledge, the other one represents blood or the bloodline. So it's that theme that comes through.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. So, Willie, looking ahead, do you believe a final Nephilim Messiah figure is still prophesied to appear in the future, completing the ancient pattern that began before the deluge?
Yes, I believe so. I believe so. And we have not yet discussed the cosmic code or the celestial code. I make a lot about this in the Nephilim trilogy. I discovered this code through my research over 40 years, and which is just what we find also in the Bible, where reference is made to the celestial script, the script in the skies, in the celestial skies. And also
celestial code.
Yes, and also in ancient Sumer, the writing in the celestial skies. So it's not astrology, it's nothing to do with Babylonian astrology. So there's a certain script written in the celestial skies. If we can read it, we understand what will happen. So, for example, the wise men, they saw the star of Jesus, the Magi, and they came and they saw the child Jesus. So these people expected, according to the celestial code, they knew the Messiah would be born to the house of David. So now what we find is, for example, Gilgamesh. He lived. We've already associated his time, especially a time shortly before him, with the Tower of Babel events. And what is interesting, it was during that period that Tuban was the polar star. Tuban is the star in Draco. And all those events can be discussed in detail with regard to that celestial aspect. I do this in the first volume of the trilogy. And then we find with the Akkadian emperors that the Akkadian Empire rose to the scene towards the climax of the age of Taurus. So that was the climatic period of the age of Taurus. The same happened with regard to the Roman emperors, to Augustus, to Julius, and then Augustus, the first emperor. His dynasty ruled in the period when this next age, the age of Aries, came to a climax. And I've already mentioned how Virgil connect him and his appearance on the world scene as a Messiah with the oracles of the Etruscans, who awaited such a Messiah towards the final age. And this final age was the final part of the age of Aries. So the climax period, he arose to the scene. So this is why I believe, according to the cosmic code, that towards the climatic years of the present age of Pisces, we will see another messianic, Nephilim messianic figure arouse to the scene, and he will be, in biblical terms, in the same way that Augustus and Nero could be seen as types of the Antichrist, he could be seen as the long-expected biblical Antichrist, yes.
Yeah, the archetype. Yeah. Willie, and just interesting, before we had our discussion, we talked about the PN god that was the ninth god born, and Gilgamesh is the ninth born as well. Can you quickly just sort of cover that?
So what we have is that there's this continuous tradition from the earliest of times, this messianic lineage, the serpent line, that throughout the ages provide these different messianic Nephilim messiahs that's born from this lineage. And as I've said, I believe that this will happen again. The ninth aspect is not so easy just to explain in a few words, because it's actually quite an extensive topic to explain it in some detail. I think we'll have to do it another time.
Something down the line, yes. Well, thank you very much. So, Willie, your Nine Ages and Nephilim trilogy, the way I see it, it doesn't just rewrite ancient history, it exposes that hidden thread of power, prophecy, and counterfeit salvation that stretches from the dawn of civilization to our own time. And I really want to motivate people when they listen to our podcast. It should change how you read your Bible, how you read Sumerian epics, and even today's headlines.
Absolutely.
But yeah. I do have a question for our Nine Ages community. If the Nephilim Messiah archetype has already appeared from the pre-flood era through Gilgamesh, the Akkadian god kings, and the Caesars of Rome, where do you see its influence or next appearance in our world today? So that should be an interesting, sort of question to ponder. But yeah, Willie, any last comments from your side?
No, we would like to hear from the community and read their comments. It will be very interesting.
And please like and subscribe.
Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you, Willie.
It's my pleasure.